Welcome to English Mystery Channel, where we make learning English fun and easy through mystery stories. The Man Who Defied Justice. In the heart of a city that prided itself on law, order, and decency, a man emerged who would challenge every notion of right and wrong. His name was Jonathan Cade, and his deeds were so vile, so unthinkable, that the world should have turned its back on him. Yet, to the bewilderment of many, the opposite occurred. The first time Jonathan Cade made the news, it was for something so horrific that people assumed he would be brought to justice swiftly. He had publicly confessed to a crime that sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. But what was even more shocking was how he did it, with a smile, almost as if he were proud. The news anchor, usually so composed, stumbled over her words as she reported it. Yet, instead of condemnation, the story took an unexpected turn. Jonathan Cade became a sensation overnight. The media was relentless, but not in the way one would expect. Instead of denouncing him, they seemed fascinated by him. Talk shows discussed his charismatic presence, while news outlets analyzed his every move, every word, as if he were a celebrity. People started to tune in, not out of fear or disgust, but out of a twisted sense of admiration. They wanted to know what Jonathan Cade would do next. I, Robert Kane, a writer with a deep interest in the human psyche, could not look away. I wanted to understand what drove a man like Jonathan Cade. Was he insane, or was there something more sinister at play? I knew I had to get close to him, to see what the world was missing. But as I began my journey into the dark world of Jonathan Cade, I found that I was not alone. The religious authorities, who should have been condemning his actions, began to speak of him in a different light. They claimed he was a man of great power, someone who understood the darker sides of life that most people feared to acknowledge. Some even suggested that he was a messenger, sent to challenge the way we view good and evil. It was as if they were defending him, trying to find a place for him within their teachings. This was madness, I thought. How could anyone defend a man like Jonathan Cade? Yet, there they were, men and women of faith, standing by his side. I had to dig deeper, to find out what was happening behind the scenes. How could a man who committed such heinous acts in broad daylight be revered by so many? My first step was to reach out to law enforcement. Surely, they would have the answers. But when I spoke to them, I realized that they were as confused as I was. They had tried to bring Jonathan Cade to justice, but every time they thought they had him cornered, he slipped through their fingers. It was as if the very laws that should have bound him had no power over him. He's like a ghost, one officer told me, shaking his head in frustration. We've got evidence, witnesses, but every time we try to move forward, something stops us. It's like there's an invisible hand protecting him. I was determined to find out what that invisible hand was. I delved into Jonathan Cade's past, hoping to find some clue that would explain how he became the man he was. But his past was as elusive as his present. Records were missing, witnesses were uncooperative, and those who did speak of him could only describe him in vague, almost mythical terms. One night, as I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by notes and clippings, I received a phone call. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper, but there was a sense of urgency in it. You're looking for Jonathan Cade, the voice said. I can help you find him, but you must be careful. He's not what you think he is. Before I could ask who was speaking, the line went dead. I was left staring at the phone, my heart racing. Who was this mysterious caller, and why had they reached out to me? I had no choice but to follow the lead. The next day, I received an envelope under my door. Inside was a single piece of paper with an address written on it. No name, no explanation. Just an address. I knew I was walking into something dangerous, but my curiosity got the better of me. I had to know who Jonathan Cade really was. The address led me to an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of the city. The doors creaked as I pushed them open, and the air inside was thick with dust and decay. But there, in the middle of the room, stood a figure, tall, with an aura of calm that seemed out of place in such a setting. It was Jonathan Cade. He looked at me with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I've been expecting you, he said, his voice smooth and confident. You're here to understand, aren't you? I nodded, unable to speak. This was the man who had committed unspeakable acts, and yet there was something about him that drew me in. Sit, he said, motioning to a bench. I obeyed, my mind racing with questions. You see, Robert, he began, people fear what they don't understand. They've built their lives around rules and laws, around concepts of good and evil that are so rigid they can't see the truth. And what is the truth? I managed to ask. The truth, he said, leaning in closer, is that there is no good or evil. There is only power and those who are willing to use it. The world sees me as a monster because I don't follow their rules. But I am free, Robert. I am free to do as I please because I understand that the rules are just an illusion. His words were like a poison, seeping into my mind. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but something stopped me. Was it fear? Or was it the realization that, in some twisted way, he might be right? Why do the religious authorities defend you? I asked, trying to change the subject. Because they see in me what they've always feared to acknowledge, he replied. They preach about the power of faith, about the battle between good and evil, but deep down, they know that it's all a game. I've simply learned to play it better than they have. And the law? I pressed. How do you avoid justice? Justice, he laughed, is a tool of the powerful. I've simply taken it and used it for my own purposes. The law is not about right or wrong, Robert. It's about control. And as long as I can control the narrative, I am untouchable. I felt a cold sweat on my brow. This man, this monster, had found a way to twist the world's most sacred institutions to his will. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't help but be fascinated by his logic. Why are you telling me this? I asked, my voice trembling. Because you, Robert, are different, he said, his eyes piercing into mine. You're not like the others. You want to understand, and that makes you dangerous. But it also makes you useful. Useful for what? To tell my story, he replied. The world needs to know that there is another way, a way that doesn't rely on outdated concepts of morality. You will write my story, Robert, and in doing so, you will set the stage for a new understanding of power. I wanted to refuse, to tell him that I would never do such a thing. But as I looked into his eyes, I felt my resolve weaken. There was something about Jonathan Cade that made it impossible to say no. I'll think about it, I said, standing up to leave. Take your time, he said with a smile. But remember, Robert, the truth is a powerful thing. Once you see it, there's no going back. I left the church that night, my mind in turmoil. I had come looking for answers, and what I had found was a man who defied everything I thought I knew about the world. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he was right about one thing: the world was not as black and white as I had once believed. Over the next few weeks, I found myself unable to think about anything other than Jonathan Cade. I pored over my notes, trying to make sense of what I had learned. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. And then it hit me, Jonathan Cade was not just a man, he was a symbol, a representation of the world's darkest desires. He had become a mirror, reflecting the hidden truths that society refused to acknowledge. In him, people saw their own fears, their own doubts, and instead of facing them, they had chosen to revere him, to turn him into a celebrity. The media, the religious authorities, the law, they were all complicit in this. They had allowed Jonathan Cade to become a force that could not be contained because they were too afraid to confront the reality he represented. I knew then what I had to do. I had to write his story, but not in the way he expected. I would expose him for what he truly was, a man who had exploited the weaknesses of society to his advantage. I would show the world that Jonathan Cade was not a hero, but a reflection of its own darkest impulses. But as I sat down to write, I felt a strange sense of dread. What if, by telling Jonathan Cade's story, I was playing right into his hands? What if he was right, and by exposing him, I would only fuel the fascination and admiration that people already had for him? The thought gnawed at me, but I knew I couldn't let it stop me. The world had to see the truth, even if it wasn't ready to accept it. I began to write, pouring my thoughts onto the page. I described the first time I saw him on the news, the way his crimes were reported with an eerie sense of detachment, as if the horrors he committed were just another form of entertainment. I wrote about the way the media fawned over him, turning his atrocities into headlines that sold papers and boosted ratings. I recounted my meeting with the police, their frustration and helplessness as they tried and failed to bring him to justice. I described the strange and unsettling defense of Jonathan Cade by religious authorities, their attempt to find some twisted sense of righteousness in his actions. And then I wrote about our meeting in the abandoned church. I detailed every word he spoke, every chilling truth he revealed about the nature of power, justice, and morality. I didn't shy away from the uncomfortable reality that Jonathan Cade was, in some ways, right, that the world was not as clear-cut as we like to believe, and that the institutions we relied on for order and justice were flawed and easily manipulated. But I also made it clear that this did not make him a hero. Jonathan Cade was a predator, someone who had seen the cracks in the system and exploited them for his own gain. He was not a symbol to be revered but a warning of what could happen when the worst parts of human nature were allowed to flourish unchecked. As I wrote, I felt a sense of urgency, as if I was racing against time. I didn't know why, but I had the distinct feeling that once this story was out in the world, everything would change. I had to get it right. I had to make people see. Finally, after days of writing without sleep, the story was finished. I sat back and read through it, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. This was it. This was the truth, as raw and unfiltered as I could make it. I submitted the story to the publication I worked for, unsure of how it would be received. The editor called me the next day, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Curiosity? Or maybe, like me, she felt that this story was dangerous in a way we couldn't fully understand. This is powerful, she said. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Yes, I replied, though my voice wavered slightly. The world needs to know. The story went live the next day, and the response was immediate. It spread like wildfire, with people from all corners of the world sharing it, discussing it, and debating it. Some praised it for its honesty and courage, while others condemned it, accusing me of glorifying a monster. But what disturbed me most were the messages from those who seemed to take Jonathan Cade's words to heart. They wrote to me, saying that they finally understood what he was trying to say, that they had always felt there was something wrong with the way the world worked, and now they saw the truth. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected people to latch onto his twisted philosophy, to see him as a figure of enlightenment rather than the villain he was. My intention had been to expose him, to show the world how dangerous he was, but instead, I had given him a platform. The days that followed were a blur. I received phone calls, emails, even threats from people who either loved or hated what I had written. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. One night, as I was sitting alone in my apartment, I received another phone call. This time, the voice on the other end was one I recognized. You've done well, Robert, Jonathan Cade said, his voice as calm and confident as ever. What do you want? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. I wanted to thank you, he replied. You've done exactly what I hoped you would. You've helped people see the truth. That wasn't my intention, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I wanted to expose you, to show the world what you really are. And you did, he said, almost as if he were amused. But the truth is a funny thing, Robert. It's not something you can control. Once it's out there, it takes on a life of its own. I felt a cold dread settle over me. He was right. I had unleashed something that I couldn't take back, something that was now beyond my control. What do you want from me? I asked again, this time more desperately. I want you to keep writing, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. The world needs people like you, Robert, people who are willing to look beyond the surface, who aren't afraid to confront the uncomfortable truths. You've done well so far, but there's more to be done. I won't do it, I said, my voice shaking with defiance. I won't be a part of your twisted game. You don't have a choice, he replied calmly. The story has already begun, and now you're a part of it. You can try to run from it, but it will follow you, Robert. It will haunt you until you see it through to the end. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling. I knew he was right. I had started something that I couldn't stop, and now I was trapped in the story I had helped create. Over the following weeks, I tried to distance myself from the story, from Jonathan Cade, but it was impossible. Everywhere I turned, there he was, on the news, in conversations, in the minds of people who had been drawn to his message. I felt like I was living in a nightmare, one that I couldn't wake up from. Then, one day, I received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, but I knew immediately who it was from. Inside was a single, handwritten note. You've done well, Robert. But the story isn't over. There's still more to uncover, more truth to be told. And I know you'll be the one to tell it. J.K. I stared at the note, my mind racing with a mix of fear and confusion. What more was there to uncover? What truth was he talking about? And why did he think I would be the one to tell it? As I sat there, holding the note, I realized that I was at a crossroads. I could try to ignore it, to walk away from the story and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. Jonathan Cade had set something in motion, and I was now a part of it, whether I liked it or not. I knew then that I had to continue the story. But this time, I would do it on my terms. I would dig deeper, uncover the truth that Jonathan Cade was so confident in, and expose it for what it really was. I would show the world that there was nothing noble or enlightened about what he was doing, that he was nothing more than a manipulator, a man who had found a way to exploit the darkest parts of human nature for his own gain. And so, with a heavy heart, I began to write again. But this time, I wasn't writing for the world. I was writing for myself, for the truth, and for the hope that, somehow, I could undo the damage that had been done. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I continued my investigation. I dug into Jonathan Cade's past, trying to find the origins of his twisted philosophy. I spoke to people who had known him, trying to understand how a man could become so detached from the basic principles of morality. What I found was a trail of broken lives, of people who had been drawn into his web of manipulation and left shattered in its wake. He had a way of getting inside people's heads, of making them question everything they thought they knew about the world. And once they were hooked, there was no escape. But as I dug deeper, I also found something else, something that terrified me. Jonathan Cade wasn't just a man who had lost his way, he was a man who had discovered a power that most people didn't even know existed. A power to control, to influence, to bend the very fabric of reality to his will. It was then that I realized the true danger of Jonathan Cade. He wasn't just a man who had committed unspeakable acts, he was a man who had discovered how to turn those acts into something people could accept, even admire. He had found a way to twist the very concept of good and evil, to make people question what they had always believed to be true. And as I continued to write, I realized that the story wasn't just about Jonathan Cade anymore. It was about all of us, about the darkness that lies within every human soul, and the thin line that separates us from the monsters we feared. I knew that my story would not have a happy ending. There was no way to undo what had been done, no way to turn back the clock. But I also knew that I couldn't stop. The truth was out there, and it was my job to find it, no matter the cost. As the months went by, I became more and more consumed by the story. It was all I could think about, all I could focus on. I barely slept, barely ate, and my relationships with friends and family began to deteriorate. They worried about me, told me to stop, to take a break, but I couldn't. I was too deep in, too obsessed with finding the truth and exposing Jonathan Cade for what he really was. One night, after another long day of researching and writing, I received another phone call. This time, the voice on the other end was not Jonathan Cade's, but someone who claimed to have information that I would want to hear. They wouldn't give their name, but they insisted on meeting in person. Against my better judgment, I agreed. I met the informant in a secluded park late at night, my nerves on edge. When they arrived, I saw it was a man in his late 40s, with a weary expression and eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "You're the writer, right?" he asked, his voice hushed as he looked around, making sure we were alone. "Yes," I replied. "What do you have for me?" He hesitated for a moment before handing me a small envelope. "This is what you need. It's the key to understanding everything about Cade." I took the envelope, my heart pounding. "What's in here?" "Evidence," he said simply. "But be careful. Once you see what's inside, there's no going back." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the envelope in my hands. I rushed home, eager and terrified to see what the man had given me. Inside the envelope, I found a collection of documents, photographs, and a single USB drive. The documents detailed Jonathan Cade's early life, his time in college, and the strange group he had been a part of, an obscure organization that seemed to delve into the study of human psychology, manipulation, and something even darker. The photographs showed Cade with various influential figures, some of whom were known for their controversial and extreme ideologies. But what caught my attention the most was the USB drive. I plugged it into my computer, my hands trembling as I waited for it to load. The drive contained several video files, each one more disturbing than the last. They showed Jonathan Cade in private meetings with members of this mysterious group, discussing ways to exploit human fears, to control the masses through psychological manipulation. There were recordings of experiments, unethical, inhumane experiments, designed to break people's spirits, to make them question their reality. But the most chilling video was the last one. It showed Jonathan Cade, much younger, addressing a group of his peers. In it, he laid out his vision of the world, one where traditional concepts of good and evil no longer applied, where the strong would dominate the weak through sheer force of will and intellect. He spoke of creating a new order, one where the lines between right and wrong were blurred. Where the only truth was the one he dictated. I watched the video in horror, realizing that Jonathan Cade had been planning this for years. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a mastermind, someone who had been carefully crafting his rise to power from the shadows, using his knowledge of human nature to manipulate the world to his liking. I knew then that this was the truth I had been searching for, the truth that Jonathan Cade had wanted to keep hidden. But it was also a truth that terrified me, because I realized just how deep his influence went, how many people he had already drawn into his web. With this new information, I wrote a second article, one that exposed the full extent of Jonathan Cade's plans. His connections, and the dark philosophy that drove him. This time, I didn't hold back. I included everything, the documents, the photographs, the videos. I wanted the world to see the man behind the mask, to understand the true danger he represented. The article was published the next day, and the response was even more explosive than before. People were shocked, outraged, and frightened by what they read. There were calls for investigations, for arrests, for something to be done to stop Jonathan Cade before it was too late. But amidst the uproar, there was also a growing number of voices defending him, claiming that he was misunderstood, that he was a visionary ahead of his time. They argued that his ideas, while extreme, were a necessary response to a world that was already broken, that he was offering a new way forward. These defenders worried me the most, because they showed just how powerful Jonathan Cade's influence had become. He had planted the seeds of doubt. And now they were beginning to grow, spreading his twisted ideology to more and more people. Despite the backlash, I knew I couldn't stop. I continued to investigate, to dig deeper into Jonathan Cade's past, his connections, and his influence. I interviewed more people who had known him, who had been affected by his actions. And the picture that emerged was even darker than I had imagined. Jonathan Cade wasn't just a man who had stumbled upon a dangerous idea. He was someone who had actively sought out power, who had manipulated and destroyed anyone who stood in his way. He had built an empire on the backs of those he had broken. And now he was poised to take control of something far bigger than anyone realized. As I continued to write, the threats against me increased. I received phone calls, letters, even visits from people who warned me to stop, to let it go before I got hurt. But I couldn't. I was too close to the truth, too close to exposing the full extent of Jonathan Cade's evil. And then, one day, I received a final phone call from Jonathan Cade himself. "You've done well, Robert," he said, his voice as calm and composed as ever. "But I think it's time you stopped." "I won't stop," I replied, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "I'm going to expose you, Jonathan. I'm going to show the world what you really are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought he had hung up. But then, he spoke again, his voice softer, almost amused. "You've already done that, Robert. But you still don't understand, do you? You think you're fighting against me, but all you're doing is helping me. Every word you write, every article you publish, it only makes me stronger. People don't fear me, Robert. They admire me. They see the truth in what I'm saying, and no matter how hard you try, you can't stop that." I felt a cold dread settle over me as his words sank in. He was right. No matter how much I exposed, no matter how many truths I revealed, there would always be those who saw Jonathan Cade not as a monster, but as a savior. "Goodbye, Robert," he said finally, his voice filled with a chilling certainty. "I'll be seeing you." The line went dead, and I was left alone, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling more lost and terrified than I ever had before. In the days that followed, I realized that I had reached the end of the story. There was nothing more I could do, nothing more I could say. Jonathan Cade had won, not because he was right, but because he had tapped into something far darker and more powerful than I could ever hope to defeat. I published one final article, not to expose Jonathan Cade, but to warn the world. I wrote about the dangers of following someone like him, of allowing fear and anger to blind us to the truth. I pleaded with people to see him for what he was: a manipulator, a predator, a man who had found a way to exploit the worst parts of our nature. But I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't be enough. The seeds had already been planted, and now they were growing, spreading like a cancer through society. As I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the remnants of my research, I felt a deep sense of despair. I had set out to expose a monster, but in the end, I had only helped to create one. And so, with a heavy heart, I put down my pen and closed my laptop, knowing that the story was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. In the end, Jonathan Cade was right. The world wasn't ready for the truth, because the truth was too terrifying to face. But as I walked away from the story, I knew that it was a truth we would all have to confront, sooner or later. Because monsters like Jonathan Cade don't just disappear, they evolve, they adapt, and they come back stronger than ever. And the next time, there might not be someone like me to warn the world before it's too late. Thanks for watching our video. We appreciate your support. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content.